Right, hi, welcome to this Manchester University Press event. Over the past year, from Black Lives Matter protests to those in Bristol, London, Manchester, and elsewhere in response to the Crime, Policing, and Sentencing Bill in March 2021, as well as the 40th anniversary of the Brixton riots, the spotlight is firmly on protest and resistance to state power, and particularly in terms of racism, policing, and criminal justice, as well as state responses to such issues. In addition to this, both the US and the UK have seen conservative and government attempts to diminish the contemporary reality, if not also the history of racism, including in policing and criminal justice. In the US with the 1776 report, and the UK with the recent race report. To help us understand this moment, these issues, and the history of anti-racist struggle and resistance to the state and criminal injustice, we bring together three key thinkers. The first is Margarita Aragon of Goldsmiths, author of the forthcoming book, A Savage Song, Racist Violence and Armed Resistance in Early 20th Century US-Mexico Borderlands. Adam Elliott Cooper from University of Greenwich and the Sarah Parker Remond Center at UCL, author of the forthcoming book, Black Resistance to British Policing. And Simon Paplow from University of Warwick, author of Race, Riots, and Thatcher's Britain. I'd like to thank you all for agreeing to participate, and thank you all for attending. All three books were published by MUP's Racism, Resistance, and Social Change series, which Satnam Birdi, John Solomos, and I are co-editors with Tom Dark of MUP, who along with Chris Hart helped organize this event. So thank you very much. Racism, Resistance, and Social Change, the series, is committed to providing a forum for the publication of challenging and innovative scholarship from a range of theoretical and political perspectives on questions of race, racism, ethnic relations, based around but not limited to three themes and questions. The first is mapping the changing forms and nature of racism in the contemporary age. The second is understanding racism over the longue durée, or reconnecting the present to the past. And three, anti-racism as intellectual and social movement, something all three authors in their books do. I'd like to now turn it over to our great speakers, and a Q&A will follow. We'll start with Margarita.
Okay, so again, thank you to Aaron and Chris and Tom for organizing this. It's really nice to have the opportunity to hear about the other books in the series, and thanks to everybody for coming. So I'll tell you a little bit about my book, which is about anti-Black and anti-Mexican racist violence in the early 20th century. So I consider both kind of extra legal violence used by white civilians in the form of lynching and pogroms, as well as violence used by police and other law enforcement. So I also consider the ways in which Black and Mexican thinkers and activists at this time sought to resist violence and contest US racism more widely. So I look at four historical moments in the book. So in thinking about anti-Black and anti-Mexican racism together, I've not tried to approach these experiences as variants of the same monolithic white racism, but instead look at them as emerging from distinct but interrelated historical processes. So thinking about transatlantic slavery and imperialist expansion, each of which unfold obviously within the advance of racialized capitalism in the Americas. So in the book, I've tried to examine the ways in which these different historical processes and these different forms of racism kind of inflect and shape each other. So in particular, I think about how the deep kind of anti-Black racism in the United States, which has been so central to kind of social order in the US, has shaped Mexican responses to racism and racist violence. So I've also particularly paid attention to constructions of racialized masculinity. So as we know, as feminist scholars have argued for a very long time, gender and race are mutually constituted. So I'll say a little bit today about the construction of white racial masculinity that emerges within these kind of US cultures of racist violence. So I think it's kind of essential to understanding our understanding and our insight into how this violence was made sense of, both by those who perpetrated it, as well as the ways in which people responded to it. So the moments I look at in the book, which all take place between 1910 and 1920, are kind of obviously localized and grounded in their own local histories, but also part of this broader context of overlapping and ongoing struggles at this time, at the kind of turn of the 20th century. So from the end of the 19th century, the suppression of Black political and social citizenship was being consolidated through disenfranchisement and segregation, which was legally codified in various ways, including in racial hygiene laws, and police through mob terrorism, which, as people probably know, is essentially condoned by the government or the federal government, which didn't take any action to stop it. And also, sometimes law enforcement participated in this violence. So in this same period when Jim Crow is being sort of consolidated in the South is also a moment when the US is embarking on new imperial projects in the Caribbean, in Asia, and in Mexico as well. So before the Mexican Revolution in 1910, Americans owned something like 27% of Mexican land. So obviously this had very profound implications for the construction of Mexican race in the United States. So these are projects of racial apartheid at home and kind of imperialist expansion abroad were mutually invigorating and kind of created this very kind of rabid discourse of race in this period that again is very gendered, this discourse of white civilization, of Anglo-Saxon manhood and race. So this is kind of a shift from earlier periods. So in the 19th century, kind of idealized versions of white racial manhood emphasized restraint and self-control. And in the 20th century, in this moment, there's this kind of language of masculine virility and white men's innate drive to conquer and destroy that is being articulated by politicians, by social scientists, by cultural commentators to explain colonialism and racialized subjugation, both in the past and present and future of the United States. So the title of my book comes from an essay written by the novelist and journalist and very prolific writer Jack London, who wrote Call of the Wilds and various other kind of books about rugged white men doing rugged things in the wilderness. So in 1903, he published this essay that examines the global domination of the Anglo-Saxon race. So he's kind of reflecting on what it means. So he writes that the 20th century dawns in blood, and it's going to continue along that course. So he says that over the course of the 19th century, millions of people were destroyed through their contact with quote superior civilization. So he's kind of playing with this idea of civilization as a force of violence and brutality. So he says, these are just kind of the brute facts of evolution. We can't wring our hands about this. We can't try to do anything about it. So he kind of suggests that white men have this urge for progress that is naturally genocidal. And we can see this at home where Americans lynch people for entertainment, and we can see this on the global scale. So he writes, the Anglo-Saxons steps forward in primal nakedness to conquer more decadent peoples. So in the essay, he refers to Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, Kipling obviously being one of yours, English poet. So he writes this poem, The White Man's Burden, to commemorate the US invasion and occupation of the Philippines. So again, he asserts in kind of a more romantic way that white men have a global duty to wage, quote, savage wars of peace. So again, presenting violence as a progressive force for civilization. So in response to this, Jack London writes, when Kipling sings his savage song of sweat, toil, and blood welter, the race is savagely responds. So I use this phrase for the title of my book to kind of capture this particular gendered construction of white violence that emerges in various ways across the moments I look at. So to end with one example, one of the episodes that I consider in the book is the repression of an uprising along the border in Texas in 1915 by ethnic Mexicans. So this, I won't go into kind of the bigger political aims of this movement, but it explicitly critiques American racism. It kind of invited, in imperfect ways, invited Black people and Native Americans to participate in the uprising. And it also made anarchist-inspired critiques of US capitalism. So this uprising had these bigger aims, but it was provoked in large part in response to the ongoing brutality of the Texas Rangers. So the Texas Rangers are like a police, like a border police force. They were originally formed as a paramilitary body to protect and drive forward white settlement in the 19th century. And in the 20th century, they're still kind of instrumental in enforcing racial order in South Texas. So to kind of give you an indication of the violence of the Texas Rangers, between 1907 and 1912, Rangers and other law enforcement killed at least 16 Mexicans for resisting arrest in this area. And this, bear in mind, this is not like a densely populated urban area. This is very sparsely populated. So to kill 16 people on record, and of course there would have been others that weren't recorded, is quite striking. So when this uprising occurred, when Mexicans rose up and attacked kind of symbols of white capitalism in the area, they attacked the railroad and white people's property. The Rangers responded with a wave of repression, working together with white militia groups. They killed possibly as many as 2,000 people of Mexican descent in the period of, like, I don't know, a year. So many of these people that they murdered had nothing to do with the uprising. And as part of the kind of reign of terror, I guess you could say, they left often people's bodies exposed. So people couldn't collect their loved ones who's been killed because they were afraid of retaliation by the Rangers. So I kind of think about how this uprising and its repression were understood and commemorated by white Americans through a kind of frontier mythology. So a white man who participated in these events and who later wrote a history of them named Virgil Lott, this history that he wrote in the 1950s, he kind of presents the Rangers' repression as evidence essentially of white racial destiny. So he says, this race, being the white race, had fought for all it ever gained, and it had gained much since its trek from the shores of Albion. Albion is like a mythological name for England. So again, the Anglo-Saxon theme. So since its trek from the shores of Albion to the Rio Grande, therefore fighting was not new to it, as attested by the gruesome skeletons found even at this late date, 20 years after, in the wilderness, lying in neatly arranged rows side by side, each with a trim, round, bullet hole hole in the forehead squarely between the empty eye sockets. So it's essentially kind of romanticizing that law enforcement killed, murdered people and left their bodies to be unburied in public. And this is kind of presented as attesting to the fortitude of white Texans and their purification of the wilderness for settlement. So this kind of exemplifies how, in different ways across the examples I look at in the early 20th century, descriptions of violence might depict white women or white communities as being threatened by racial others, but white men's mastery is continually articulated and kind of illustrated and demonstrated through depictions of white men's kind of masculine punishment of racial transgression. So white vulnerability is always accompanied by narratives of white aggression and mastery. So just as a kind of concluding thought, I think it's very interesting because obviously there's kind of a continuity with these themes of sort of savagery and civilization and contemporary discourses of policing. But I think this kind of element of white men and mastery, arguably has shifted now, whereas white men and police are kind of always presented as being perpetually under threat. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to our next speaker, Adam Elliott Cooper.
Thanks so much, Aaron, and thanks so much to everyone for organising this event this afternoon. As Aaron mentioned at the start, this year is of course 40 years since the Brixton uprisings, and as many people will be remembering this summer, just 1 year on from the BLM process of 2020. But my book kind of begins with another important anniversary, 10 years from the civil unrest of 2011 and the police killing of Mark Duggan. And the reason that the book begins at this moment is because there were three, I think, really important and influential police killings in 2011. The first was a reggae artist called Smiley Culture, which led to one of the largest black-led protests in London since the McPherson campaign. The Stephen Lawrence campaign. The next was a man called Kingsley Burrell in Birmingham, which led to one of the largest black-led protests in Birmingham for a number of decades. And then, of course, in the summer of 2011, you have the police killing of Mark Duggan. And a lot of the kind of discourse and writing and commentary that kind of surrounded the civil unrest question the extent to which we can understand what was taking place as being political and being a political assertion. Apart from a few people, perhaps most famously Darcus Howe, who described the unrest as an insurrection, you had commentators, including those on the left and those part of the radical anti-racist left, talk sometimes about these protesters being unthinking or not political or not committed or linked to any kind of political or community struggle. And at very best, commentators articulated the unrest as being the decline of Black politics. But what I began to see on the ground, and at this time I wasn't doing my doctoral research, I was a youth worker working in Hackney. What I began to see on the ground wasn't a decline or lack of politics. And I think that became apparent for maybe 2 or 3 reasons, in which these are things that I talk about in some detail in the book. The first that really occurred to me was the fact that the unrest took place in a wider context of Black organising against state violence. Not only the protests that I've already mentioned, but also a number of other family-led campaigns led by a campaign group called United Family and Friends campaign, which was led mainly by women who had lost loved ones at the hands of the police, mainly Black women. And they saw their largest mobilisation in the October of 2011, very much connected to the unrest which took place earlier that year. But the other thing that was really crucial about the political nature of this unrest was the state's response to it, and the fact that the state responded to this unrest with a very kind of political kind of violence, in which we saw 24-hour courts, we saw the judges being told to give maximum sentences. We see a whole sweeping wave of very political kinds of policing and judicial interventions being made on the part of the state. And so in response to that very political response to the state, we see another wave of Black organising, defence campaigns in parts of Britain's urban areas like Tottenham, like Hackney, like Birmingham, like Manchester. A whole swathe of Black community campaigns emerged there. And so I began to get involved in these campaigns as a youth worker, and I begin to write about them. And so while this book kind of emerges out of a PhD thesis, it begins as a series of blog articles cataloguing the kinds of community campaigns that are arising in places like Tottenham in North London, where people are attempting to resist the raids, the arrests, the searches, the harassment and the violence which accompanies the civil unrest on the part of the state. And what begins to become apparent as I'm carrying out the research and as I'm writing this book is that these formations, these family-led campaigns, mainly led by women, these community defence campaigns, as well as the civil unrest, is a vital prelude to understanding the emergence of Black Lives Matter in Britain, first through solidarity campaigns in 2014 and 2015, eventually the establishment of a Black Lives Matter UK group in 2015-2016, and of course the mass protests that we see in 2020, the largest anti-racist protests in British history. But the other thing that I try to think through in this book is history, which seems like a weird thing to leave till the end, but I think is also something important to think through. And the reason I think it's important is partly because Britain too often attempts to create the impression that questions of racism arrived in Britain in the post-war period as significant numbers of people from Africa, Asia and the Caribbean began to establish communities here on the British mainland. And so what I seek to also do in the book is begin each chapter with a colonial history, demonstrating the manner in which British colonial racisms set the scene and are fundamental for understanding the struggles that Black communities are engaged in against policing in the 21st century. And this is also crucial because of the first chapter in the book, which looks at the Black Power movement and the anti-colonial movements in Britain, which were not simply seeking to challenge British state racism, but also British and other forms of imperialism. And I think that history of Black British anti-imperialism is really fundamental for understanding Black resistance's engagement, not simply in anti-racism, but anti-capitalism and anti-race, as well as anti-colonialism. And it's that history that I think connects to 2020 in really crucial ways, because the most radical elements of the movement in 2020 have articulated a politics of abolition. And that politics of abolition seeks to not only envisage a world in which police and prisons are obsolete, but also, of course, a world in which capitalist exploitation and state racism and imperialism have also been dismantled. And this anti-capitalist politics and anti-imperialist politics, which is fundamental to the politics of police and prison abolition hasn't emerged out of a vacuum and hasn't simply been borrowed from the United States. It's something which has been a fundamental part of Black Britain's radical tradition, reaching back into those histories, not simply to its Black Power movements here on the British mainland in the 60s and 70s, but also the anti-colonial movements in parts of the Caribbean and Africa and other British colonies, which were fighting against British colonial rule in the first half of the 20th century, fundamentally shaping the anti-racist politics of the generation of people that migrated to the mother country. And so it's through those historically constituted uprisings of Black resistance against British state racism, both on the British mainland and in its colonies, that I hope that we can have a better understanding of the current movements that engulf this country, whether it be the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020 or the wider movements against the policing bill and other forms of state racism and border violence that we're seeing really being championed by a new generation of anti-racist and Black activists today. And I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Simon Paplow. I'll let you start and then we can go to questions.
Thank you very much. And again, echoing everyone else's thanks to everyone for organising, for coming and for kind of taking part in hopefully an interesting kind of Q&A session as well after our chats about our books and things. So in the time I have here is kind of talking a little bit about my book. I want to focus on a couple of themes which seem of particular relevance. So of those two things I want to talk about here quickly is firstly the criminalisation of protest and also kind of attitudes towards state-established quote-unquote independent inquiries. And while it's important not to oversimplify or overemphasize the uniformity of events in 1980 and 1981, we can broadly say that anti-police uprisings spread around the country in places like Bristol, Brixton. I haven't talked about Brixton being 40 years ago this weekend, basically, Liverpool and Manchester, amongst many other places. And my book explores events in those locations, Bristol, Brixton, Liverpool and Manchester, focusing on the resistance and response of Black Britons. And in the years since, in some quarters at least, the events of 1980 and 81 have acquired something of an air of legitimacy as a kind of rational response to deeply embedded racism, discrimination and disadvantage, exhibited particularly, but not exclusively, by the police through racist violence and discriminatory use of things like stop and search. And this racism and police violence was coupled with failures of various state mechanisms to address widespread criticisms and complaints. So for instance, in 1980, the Bristol Council for Racial Equality concluded that the uprisings in Bristol displayed the widespread feeling amongst Black people in Britain that there was, quote, no other way to make their points of view known. And this was shown by those involved. So a resident of St Paul's, the area of Bristol, which saw the first anti-police uprising in 1980, a resident of St Paul's declared, quote, our history shows us that the dominant community will give us no concessions unless we fight. We have no jobs, no equality of opportunity, and if burning a few banks pushes us along the road, then so be it. And as John Solomus, Professor of Sociology, and has already been mentioned, co-editor of this book series, as John Solomus has argued, not all groups enjoy the same opportunity to participate politically through channels defined as legitimate. And unsurprisingly, many commentators and politicians portrayed the uprisings in 1980 and 81 as anything but legitimate. So Thatcher herself repeatedly described the events as criminal, and concluding that, in her words, nothing but nothing justifies what happened. And the Conservative MP David Mellor kind of epitomised this position, I think, by naming it, in this is his words, grossly wrong and unfair to talk about social protest when these riots should be viewed simply as sheer criminality. And other figures attempted to link them with post-war migration and an apparent movement away from a perceived, previously monoracial Britain. So for instance, John Stokes, a Conservative MP and member of the notorious Anti-Immigration Monday Club, portrayed, in his words, these riots as something new and sinister in our long national history. And by completely disregarding Britain's long history of violent protest, this construction attempted to portray immigration, and by extension migrants, and particularly Black Britons themselves, as being the cause of this so-called new and sinister disorder. And when Thatcher's government would later announce a public inquiry into the uprisings in 1981, this was criticised by some politicians who suggested that it appeared to be legitimising the violence, that this response would signify some kind of victory for rioters who had protested in the wrong way. And this leads to the other thing I want to sort of briefly talk about here, which is public inquiries. So after the St Paul's uprising in Bristol in 1980, there were widespread calls for a public inquiry, such as from the Bristol West Indian Parents and Friends Association, who believed nothing else can put this matter right. However, these appeals in 1980 after Bristol were rejected, as the Home Secretary William Whitelaw believed that the police would be, in his words, pillied to no good purpose, really demonstrating the government's level of control over these apparently independent inquiries. And we know that while technically independent from the government, public inquiries are also largely under its control in terms of things like members, remit, and the publication, and obviously the response to their reports. And concerns have long existed as to whether public inquiries actually pay attention to voices outside of the establishment. So as one local observer from Manchester in 1981 questioned, if somebody comes in from outside the area, do they understand the issues in the first place? But demands for a public inquiry were far from universal after Bristol. And while some Bristol locals argued that nothing else would be acceptable, others believed that it would be a whitewash that would simply clear the police and white authorities of any wrongdoings or blame. So for instance, a well-attended community meeting in St Paul's recorded the general belief that any possible lessons from the uprising would be buried or deliberately misinterpreted. And these kind of divisions over public inquiry appeared particularly between community workers and the local Black population. So the Guardian newspaper, for example, reported that, in their words, unlike white figures such as local politicians, councillors, or the chairs of various community relations organisations, Black spokesmen are regarding inquiry demands with scepticism. And this scepticism towards public inquiries were reinforced by beliefs that the issues were well known to authorities, but they just didn't want to do anything about them. And as we've seen recently, that previous inquiries and reports had identified many of the issues, but little action had actually followed. And in 1981, ideas that another public inquiry would simply endorse a narrative about the uprisings that would be favourable to the authorities and to the ineffective state mechanisms claiming to be acting on the behalf of people in Britain. And while calls for public inquiry after 1980, Bristol in 1980, were ignored, a public inquiry was established after the Brixton Uprising in 1981 that was chaired by Lord Leslie Scarman. And this inquiry was set up under the 1964 Police Act. So by design, it had a greater focus on policing rather than kind of broader social, political, economic aspects. But this framed events as being, quote unquote, law and order issues, disseminating ideas that the uprisings had been kind of unprovoked attacks on the police by Black residents, further criminalising the uprisings and declaring that these exceptional threats to law and order required an exceptional response, increasing things like the militarisation of the police and furthering moves towards more heavy-handed and aggressive police tactics. And one vocal critic of Scarman's public inquiry was the Brixton Defence Campaign, which was, to use its own words, quote, an organisation of Black, African and Asian groups and individuals formed to mobilise the Black community to be fully involved in the legal and political defence of those arrested, charged or injured as a result of the uprising. And these kinds of defence campaigns appeared around the country in 1980 and 81 as Black communities mobilised locally and nationally to counter the police violence and targeting seen before, during and after the uprisings. And the Brixton Defence Campaign deemed Scarman's inquiry to be a governmental attempt to legitimise characterisations of the uprisings as, quote, blameless forces of law and order battling mainly black criminals. And they also deemed it, in their words, a grave danger to the black community, believing that any evidence that was provided to it would just be used against black people and used to target black people. And therefore they wrote to organizations and individuals believed to be intending to provide evidence to Scarman's inquiry, criticizing them for betraying the community. And Scarman's inquiry infamously declared that institutional racism did not exist in Britain, and it rejected calls to restrict the police's use of stop and search, despite acknowledging it was disproportionately used to target black people. And even Scarman's limited policy proposals were not fully implemented by Thatcher's government, who refused to admit links between their policies and the uprisings. And this led the Brixton Defence Campaign to dub Scarman's inquiry, in their words, the most successful diversionary mechanism that the state could have constructed. And a similar picture emerged after uprisings elsewhere, such as in Manchester, where a local inquiry was established by the county council, but the choice for inquiry chair of lawyer Bennett Heitner was criticised for, to use the words of Gus John, head of the local defence committee in Manchester, it was criticised for bringing in some bloody grandee who has no understanding whatsoever and has no reason to have an understanding. And so kind of one of the things talking about here is how the British state and media framed the response to the 1980-81 events around issues of law and order, criminalising those involved and diminishing the discontent and issues at the heart of events. And I think kind of, you know, this has already been touched on, but 40 years later, with some of these discussions and some of these portrayals and depictions, it appears that in some ways little has changed. So I'll leave it there, and perhaps we can discuss more in questions and things. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you to all the speakers. While the questions start to roll in, and I would encourage you to post your questions on the facility here, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. As we're starting to see, I think someone's coming in. I thought I would just start off by asking a question, and it's something I think Adam touched on and developed a little bit, but I'd like to see sort of what other people and Adam as well think. As you all engage in historical research and look at sort of the cases and formations of racism, as well as forms of resistance historically, and in the past, can you say something about how you approach historical research and what you think historical analysis can bring to our understanding of the present and current conjuncture? And by that, I mean in terms of specific issues, like talk about the protest, but also, I guess, the way in which history, or the history of racism, or I guess the history of nations, is constructed. For example, attempts to simultaneously whitewash the history of racism and colonialism, and when racism is acknowledged at all, place it in an unjust and illiberal past of a progressive and equal present, knowing that this is done to deny systemic racism, continuity, and undermine anti-racism. But if someone could, if one or all of you would like to speak to this a little bit.
I'm happy to go first.
Sure.
So I think this is really crucial to maybe riff off something Simon was just saying about inquiries, because of course the big inquiry that comes after Scarman is Macpherson. And one of the things that Macpherson does is mainstream the language of institutional racism. But the problem of Macpherson, of course, is that Macpherson's definition of institutional racism is ahistorical. So the report defines institutional racism as institutions which fail to provide an adequate and professional service to people based on colour, ethnicity, race, etc., etc. But if we think through the history of British institutions, a more radical appraisal and a more perhaps historically informed appraisal would actually argue that British institutions rely on racism in order to reproduce their power. So if we think about the history of British policing, for instance, and the fact that the history of most British policing has taken place in its colonies and not on the British mainland, and therefore racism has been a really fundamental way of rationalizing and justifying the differential treatment of different colonial subjects, then what we realize is that racism has become racism is fundamentally linked to British governance and the functioning of British institutions. And so therefore to say that British institutions reproduce racism simply because they have prejudiced people working within them, it's kind of like saying the tail wags the dog. And we can only really come to that false conclusion of how institutional racism functions if we strip institutional racism of its history and we have this ahistorical analysis of it. So I think that histories of colonialism play a really crucial role in better understanding institutional racism as it functions today, and that's something that I found really useful in my own research.
Thank you. Margarita or Simon?
Yeah, yeah, I think Adam made some really good points. I'll just kind of think about it, I guess, sort of methodologically, as someone who's a sociologist, kind of, I guess, somewhere between sociologist and historian. I think methodologically, it's just so important to examine race as a historical construction, precisely because racism has been so pervasive and is so central to kind of our social worlds that I think it's easy to kind of start to think of it as inevitable or kind of natural. So I think, to paraphrase Stuart Hall, said something like that race works to transform social relations into the timeless language of nature. So I think that it's really important to kind of examine these histories, both because it shows us this continuity, but also because it shows us that there have been shifts and change, and that, you know, ideas and kind of technologies of race have had to adapt in response to changing circumstances and resistance. But I think this also, you know, examining it as a historical construction reminds us that it's not inevitable, that the world could be otherwise, you know, and that people have been trying to make it otherwise for a really long time. So for me, I think that kind of pushes against almost some of the, rather than taking it at face value, some of these discourses like the ones I'm examining in the early 20th century that says, you know, the white race just has this natural drive to dominate and brutalize, et cetera, et cetera. I think that kind of historicizing is really important sociologically.
Thank you.
Just to jump in on there as well, if I can, I think it's kind of, I think it's probably kind of building on the kind of the British aspect of this. And I think kind of Aaron kind of talked about this in terms of, I think racism and how it's discussed in Britain is often thought of as something which happens elsewhere or doesn't happen in Britain, or kind of we don't have a history in Britain. And also this kind of is interesting, I think, in relation to what people like Tony Kushner, Kaneta Hammond-Perry have talked about in terms of this, what they describe as kind of the Windrush myth, and the idea of kind of going back to something Adam was saying in terms of kind of post-war migration, but this idea of from the Empire Windrush docking in Britain in the immediate post-war years, that we've sort of moved to this kind of multi-racial, multicultural, post-racial in some descriptions of it society, and this idea of kind of racism is something which either has happened elsewhere or has happened at different points in history, which doesn't need combating in contemporary society. I think kind of that is interesting in kind of some of the reactions to things like Black Lives Matter and sort of some of those responses in terms of how people see this as not a UK issue, but obviously historicizing that, contextualizing that, can do some of the work of demonstrating why it absolutely is, as the other two people have spoken about, in kind of different contexts.
Great, no, thank you very much. So I'm reminded of the past 2 days of television viewing where we saw Prince Philip's travels through the Commonwealth represented as some sort of utopian multicultural fantasy. There's a couple of questions coming in. The first is, to what extent did Thatcher's consideration that Mandela was a terrorist reflect her racism? And to what extent does Boris Johnson carry on racist elements of the Conservative Party? I think this might have followed, I mean, everyone's welcome to answer. I think it might have followed one of Simon's points.
I think if I just jump in there quickly, I think there's a lot of interesting aspects of that. I think I don't know whether necessarily Adam might have jumped in on this, but I think in terms of Nelson Mandela as kind of a figure in Stephen Lawrence and Scarman's, in Macpherson's report, I think is an interesting in terms of his involvement, if you like, in kind of his as a public figure in terms of the response to that and where that goes. I think I have a lot of thoughts in terms of kind of where to take this response. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry if Adam or Margarita want to jump in there while I'm kind of trying to collect my thoughts as I can.
I'm happy to. I think that one of the interesting things it might indicate is, again, Britain's how British racism is fundamentally bound up with imperialism. And how Britain's, of course, very close relationship with South Africa, which we're kind of told is this, this historic relationship. For some reason, they all speak English in South Africa, but for reasons that let's not go into. I think also helps us to unpack this really important relationship between Thatcher's racism and her bigotry and her nationalism, and how that's fundamentally bound up with not only supporting continuing existing manifestations of colonialism, such as in apartheid South Africa, but also, of course, this kind of nostalgia for empire as well, which is fundamentally important and was so integral to her maintaining power, of course, in relation to things like the Falklands. So I think that that Thatcher and the Conservative Party's attitude to apartheid South Africa and empire more generally is really, really fundamental, not only for us to better understand racism as a culture and as a discourse and as a concept, but also to think about racism as something of how racism becomes material, right? How it comes to affect people's lives, both here on the British mainland, but also, of course, in Britain's colonies and former colonies.
Okay. No, thank you. Simon, did you want to come back in?
I'm still, if we have other questions to go to, I'm still sort of formulating a kind of response. But I think I kind of agree exactly with what Adam was raising there. I think it's kind of, again, I suppose kind of linking back to the previous question, is that you're seeing this in the longer historical context and kind of that contextualizing those aspects, I think is vitally important in understanding the questions that were raised and things.
No, absolutely. No, thank you very much. So we have another question for each of the speakers. We'll say thank you to each of the speakers for their presentations. Can you, one, say something about the specific conjunctural forces that produce the forms of racialization and racism you analyze? And two, whether these forces may be understood both temporarily specific and part of a longue durée. Anyone want to give it a start? We start with the first one about how, yeah.
Like a very massive question.
You can
I guess I tried to lay that out somewhat when I was in my approach to kind of how I thought about the book. So I know, I'm looking at the early 20th century, and that is like more than 100 years ago or whatever the moments that I'm looking at. But the whole time I'm also thinking about them as part of this longer history. Just like now we can't understand what's happening now without looking at 40 years ago or whatever, trying to understand why people were lynched in 1915, you have to understand kind of the history of Reconstruction and enslavement, and also these kind of various forms of relationship between the United States and Mexico. In the 19th century, Mexico, the US waged a war of aggression against Mexico and expropriated half its territory. Mexico has its own kind of histories of colonialism and slavery. So it's very complex. And I think, it's hard work, I guess. So I found that writing the book and like kind of talking about this one moment that is like, might be several weeks in time, kind of involves all this kind of unraveling through centuries. So yeah, I guess I would say, I don't remember exactly how the question was worded, but yeah, it's part of a longer durée. And I think, in various ways we see the manifestations of it still, but again, I think there's kind of that thing about there's a continuity, but there's also change. It's not, I think that's a mistake to kind of think of white supremacy or racism as kind of this monolithic thing that is always the same, even though, you know, when I'm reading kind of descriptions of police brutality in 1917 in Houston, Texas, against Black people there, it's so just exact, sounds so similar to things that happen in London in 2021. So there is, I guess, that kind of balancing of thinking about how these forces kind of continue, but trying to get beneath that and also kind of examine the complexity, the historical complexity of it. Sorry, that probably wasn't very articulate.
That was great, thanks. What else?
I'm happy to go next. So yeah, I think there are a number of interesting conjunctural forces in, if we maybe, for instance, take the moment of 2011, where, as I mentioned already, you have a number of community-led campaigns following the police killings of Smiley Culture and Kingsley Burrell in the first few months of 2011. But something else really important happens in 2011 in the prelude to the unrest, which has been, I think, under-examined, which is the fact that a police operation called Operation Blunt 2 is imposed across the whole of London for the 3 years leading up to the summer of 2011, in which a Section 60, which effectively allows the police to stop and search anyone they wish without requiring reasonable suspicion, is imposed across much of the city. And so what you effectively have in the 3 years leading up to the civil unrest of 2011 aren't simply a series of very high-profile police killings, Smiley Culture, Kingsley Burrell, and of course Mark Duggan, but you also have effectively the sus laws imposed on London through the guise of Section 60 from May 2008 to May 2011. And of course, which was also, I think, a huge contributing factor to people taking part in the rebellions in the summer of that year. But of course, the other things that you have happening at that time were, of course, the rise of austerity. So you've got the 2010 student protests just a year before. You've got the scrapping of the educational maintenance allowance. You've got this looming threat of cuts to youth services and all of the kinds of provisions that's associated with. So you have a whole swathe of different things happening that I think are hugely important for understanding what takes place in 2011 in that particular moment. And I think, as I mentioned before, it's really crucial to understanding that as a prelude to what happens next, to the rise of Black Lives Matter and perhaps these more recognisably political formations which emerge in the 10 years previously. To the extent to which these things are temporarily specific, but also kind of demonstrate historical continuity. I think we can see this in the fact that you have a police operation which is very similar to the sus laws, but not necessarily articulated in the same way. So the sus laws are there to stamp out mugging, but of course the moral panic of the 20th century is the spectre of the gangs. And so while we see a different kind of black folk devil arising, we see similar kinds of images of black criminality and black violence mobilized. We see similar kinds of police tactics, maybe with new forms of technology and surveillance deployed in the 21st century. But of course, we see a very well-rehearsed racist playbook being deployed by people like Boris Johnson and David Cameron during this period, which they used to great effect in whipping up panic among their kind of electoral base and justifying and rationalising new forms of police repression which follow.
Thank you. And Simon?
Yeah, thank you. Just to kind of quickly answer that, is that I think Stephen Brooke has written that it's the historians have struggled to consider the 1980s outside of, I think he describes it as Margaret Thatcher's long shadow, and I think kind of it's, in the 80s, thinking about everything that that must be historicized, that must be contextualized to look at these kind of things. But kind of again building on points that the other two panelists were talking about, in the sense of what was specifically going on in the 80s, but what's kind of a longer history, how that kind of interacts, how that plays together. And I think things like, there are aspects that I sort of briefly touched on, kind of exploring the book and things, in that, some of the things like people have argued about, kind of this new right ideology and kind of a rejection of post-war consensus, obviously debates about that, but kind of, people have put that in some kind of context in terms of the some of the calls for things like public inquiries, for example, and kind of how they were responded to. Obviously, impossible, I think, to look at something like this book looks at without doing this longer history of imperialism, colonialism, and kind of the legacies of that, and how kind of, again, I think as the other two speakers have talked about, how these things are kind of so deeply embedded and deeply ingrained, and how at different points they've been highlighted, utilized, reshaped, whatever the correct word is, for different purposes or for different under different reasons. So I think it's that interplay between the specific moments and the longer contextual history, I think is really important to consider.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another question. Would the panel comment on why UK politicians and police leaders tend to refer to the McPherson definition of institutional racism as not useful? Could the language be an indication of the colonialist mindset Adam refers to in his introduction? And if you don't mind, and the person who asked the question doesn't mind, perhaps we could expand that a little bit about the rejection increasingly over the past year, also of the rejection of the concept of systemic racism.
I'm happy to jump in on that quickly. So yeah, I think we know historically that the police, for one, began the response to the McPherson inquiry by flat out denying the existence of institutional racism. So every single Met commissioner from the McPherson reports onwards has either denied the finding that the Metropolitan Police were institutionally racist, or have referred to institutional racism in the past tense. So Hogan Howard would say this was a problem in the Met, and would always talk about it in the past tense. And of course now we see Cressida Dick arguing that the language of institutional racism is unhelpful, not really describing why it's unhelpful, but simply arguing that it's unhelpful. And of course, He Who Must Not Be Named has of course published a very recent report on racial and ethnic disparities in Britain, in which, although the definition of institutional racism by McPherson is accepted by this particular report on ethnic and racial disparities, what it seeks to do is find any other indicator of inequality, such as social class and geography, as if these things are somehow disconnected from race, and race is this thing that occurs in a social and geographical vacuum away from social class and geography, to explain away the ways in which institutions in this country produce racist outcomes. But yes, I think that one of the reasons that it is necessary for these institutions to reject institutional racism is because what they realize is that the reason that these institutions reproduce racism isn't because there are people with bigoted thoughts that work in the organization, unconscious or otherwise, and therefore you can't just simply cleanse people of their unconscious bias through some kind of consultancy or training in order to improve the institution. And that in fact, in order for the institution to function as it does, it has to reproduce racism. And so their only option is to reject institutional racism as a concept, in order for them to continue functioning in the manner in which they do.
I think, just sorry to quickly jump in on there, I think kind of linking back to a previous thing previous thing we were talking about, in that I think it might have been John Burnett who made this point, in that almost kind of McPherson report and McPherson kind of declaration of institutional racism has kind of almost become part of Britain's self-congratulatory narrative. And I think kind of building on what Adam was saying, in the sense of, yes, if it's ever acknowledged, it's acknowledged as in the Met or the police used to exist institutional racism, but there doesn't anymore. I think it becomes part of this narrative about what modern day Britain is, which I think is, relates to a lot of what we were talking about before. Apologies if I spoke over you there, Margaretha.
I guess I would just add kind of on the way that Aaron expanded the question. I think it's kind of an interesting moment right now, in that, because of the demonstrations that were happening last summer. I think I read something that, like, the term systemic racism, like the Google searches for that term had increased 1,000-fold or something. And you also see this public discourse in the US and the UK where the notion of systemic racism is becoming more widely spoken about amongst the public. And I guess that, kind of even just phrases that I think, systemic racism or white supremacy, or kind of the existence of racism, is being spoken about and acknowledged in ways amongst the public that I think, in my life, I haven't really seen before. So I think that part of the rejection of notions of systemic racism are in part kind of, that is going to kind of fuel a sort of retrenchment and a kind of drawing back and a rejection of those ideas from people, like in the US with Donald Trump and that 1770, whatever that report was called, where they kind of highlight critical race theories like the devil and stuff like that. So I think that comes in tandem with the growing awareness of racism in other ways.
No, thank you. It's interesting. The second systemic racism and critical race theory become sort of commonly spoken about. It's in the context of a reactionary obsession. So another question, and apologies to those who I don't get to. Thanks to all the speakers. My question: in both the United States and the UK, racialized groups engaged in uprisings have been categorized as mindless thugs, riffraff, and a whole host of other kind of often sort of criminalizing and racialized language. What role did the news media play in shaping these discourses? I'm happy with anyone.
Jump in there.
Sure.
I think, from my personal perspective, there's a very short answer to this, which is massive. I think they play a massive role in shaping those. And in terms of how events are depicted, how events are described, whose version of events is told, whose version of events is kind of amplified, which voices are included. I think I forget the exact figures, but people have done studies into kind of the amount of newspaper coverage and media, TV and radio media after 1980 and 1981, and the police chief constables get a huge percentage of that representation, as opposed to community voices, community organisations. People might have been involved in different aspects. So I think it's, in terms of kind of amplifying and shaping responses to that, my personal view is that the media has a massive impact on that.
Thank you. Anyone else want to speak to
that? No, just to agree, massive. And I think it's really interesting kind of looking at the different ways in which unrest and uprisings were presented across the 20th century. And certainly by the time, like in America, like by 1965, when you get to Watts, there's a very kind of marked difference in the ways in which Black uprisings are presented. Again, kind of going back to that thing that I said about sort of discourses of white vulnerability. So, like with Watts as an example, they're kind of constantly talking about how many police and National Guard are killed and never speaking about how many Black civilians were killed. Whereas in the early 20th century, there's just kind of page after page describing, the death of Black people in really graphic terms, each of which obviously is serving, in kind of invigorating particular constructions, racist constructions of Blackness. So massive, and it changes kind of in interesting ways, I guess.
Okay. I've got another question. I think we have time for one more, and it's a long one, but it's a really interesting one. I think follows up. So thank you for a fantastic event. In thinking about traditions of anti-racism, which are particular to the UK, do the panelists believe there is life left in the concept of political Blackness in today's movements? If not, what are other ways we can effectively foster a radical anti-racism that doesn't play into binaries of Black and white?
So I think that the language of both racism and anti-racism, as Margarita's kind of pointed out, changes over time. And the language of racism changes over time. So we should be unsurprised that the language of anti-racism changes over time as well. And one obvious thing might be the fact that in the 1970s, Black radicals articulated their visions through the language of revolution. And today it's more common for people to articulate their radical political visions through the language of abolition. And I think we should be unsurprised that our language evolves in that regard. And so I think we should also be unsurprised that our language in relation to how we articulate solidarity and our movements also changes. So while the language of political blackness might not be as popular or as considered to be as relevant or as useful today, that doesn't mean that people across different racial categories or social divides or what have you aren't articulating a politics of solidarity in different ways that I think are really crucial. And it makes me think about some of the ways in which we see large protests, such as the protests in 2020, where we didn't just simply see big protests emerging in multi-ethnic cities, but we also saw them emerging in smaller villages and towns across the country, and people articulating solidarity in really interesting, perhaps new and novel, but yet very crucial ways there. But we also see it in ways that are, I think, often more organic. And one of the things that makes me think about is the school in Pimlico, which has had, where the students have been involved in a really quite radical and inspiring anti-racist campaign against two specific school policies. One of them is about banning hair that can be obstructive for other students, i.e. afro hair, and the other is seeking to restrict the use of hijabs, which are considered to be too colourful to be worn in school. So you can see here that the school is effectively creating racist policies against both Black and Asian young people, and they're using these two racist politics to articulate a form of anti-racist solidarity among all of these different students of colour, challenging these kinds of racist policies in the school. And while they're not articulating it through a politics of political blackness, they're clearly still articulating a politics of solidarity across these different forms of racism, I think are really crucial and inspiring for both scholars and activists.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak to that?
I could just quickly say that I agree with what Adam said. I think he expressed it much better than I would have done, but I think I agree very much in terms of this language, but also kind of, solidarity doesn't necessarily have to come in this form of a return to kind of the language of political blackness. And I think kind of Adam's.
Thank you. And I realize we've gone a little bit over time, and there's a lot more questions, and I'm sure we could do this for a lot longer. I also have a lot of questions to ask all three of you, but for the time being, I'd like to thank you for taking the time and presenting and participating, and thank everyone for attending, and thank you, Tom, Chris, and MUP, and all the best, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.